In this video, I want to give you some tips on food gardening in your backyard or on your homestead so that you can get really good crops. This is just information that I've learnt over my 26 years of food gardening, and just some tips that might make your life easier. Hi guys, I'm Elissa at Moat Cottage Homesteading, the small space homesteading channel. Firstly, when you're gardening, you have to look at the soil. The soil is alive, or it needs to be alive. Not all soil is alive. Some soil is dead, and you need to give it life and bring all those microorganisms back to it. I have a passion for doing this. I spend time finding things to add to my garden, whether it's comfrey leaves, homemade compost, animal manures, including duck and chicken, obviously, because I have them, alpaca poo. You can add in mushroom compost, did I say that already? Collecting autumn leaves to add into your compost. There's worm tea or worm wee, comfrey tea. There's just so many different things that once you get an established garden, you can add things into the soil to give it all the micronutrients, and worms will come to it and bring the soil alive with all the other goodness that you need in your garden to grow good plants. There are three main elements you've probably heard about when you're talking about gardening, and that's nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. Nitrogen gives you strong leaves. Phosphorus is for fruits and flowers, and potassium is for strong cell growth. A good source of nitrogen would be something like a fish emulsion, and phosphorus would be something like blood and bone. Although if you're using blood and bone, it takes 3 months for it to get into the soil and to release all its goodness. Potassium, which is for the strong cell growth, you would use something like sulfate or potash. Tomatoes really do well with a bit of extra potassium. Recently I heard someone saying that they weren't a good gardener. They said they were growing tomatoes, they were doing so well, and they got a good amount of fruit, and then the plant died. So they gave up. They said, I'm not a good gardener. Now, this is probably basic for many of you, but if you don't know, some plants are annuals and they are meant to die. Tomatoes are one of them. So if your tomatoes die after you've had a good season of tomatoes, that's because they're meant to. So don't be disheartened and think that you're not a good gardener if you kill your tomato plants after you've had a season of tomatoes. When you're planting in the same garden beds year after year, it's a good idea to rotate your crops. So if in the places where you've been growing your brassicas, like kale, silver beet, cabbage, spinaches, you then, the next year, you put in something like your legumes, like your beans and peas. And then the year after that, in that same location, you'd be planting your alliums, which are your garlics and chives, spring onions. So then you're rotating the crops because they need different nutrition, and they put things back into the soils, like the peas and beans. They put nutrients and nitrogen back into the soil. After you've put your alliums in, the year after, you're meant to put in your rooting and fruiting vegetables, things like carrots, zucchinis, pumpkins, potatoes, tomatoes, if I haven't said that already. So you're meant to do it that way so that you can get all the best benefits in your soil. Now, in a small garden, that isn't always the case because you're looking for spaces to plant things, and whatever's available at the time of when you've got something to plant is what you're putting in. So you've got to make sure you're adding enough goodness to the soil so that you're not just depleting the soil. Because if you have depleted soil, your plants won't thrive because they won't have the nutrition and goodness that they need to thrive. And weak plants are a magnet for insects, pest, disease, fungus. And you also don't want to keep planting the same crop over and over again in the same spot, because the bugs and pests and spores that are creating funguses and things can come in and you will not get good crops. I'm not a huge fan at all of monocrops. It's the most stupid, ridiculous thing. It doesn't even make sense because it's just attracting all the pests to come. I like to plant a few tomatoes over here, a few tomatoes over here, and in between I plant different bits and pieces all over the place. I don't have whole rows of certain things. I'll break it up so that I've got a few silver beet over here, a few silver beet over there, and then there's other plants in between. It's probably really confusing. I just have so much I want to share with you and give you some little tips to help you with your gardening. This is not a whole crash course on gardening, obviously. It's just random bits of information that I want to share with you. When you're transplanting a new tree or a seedling or a new plant into the ground, it takes 6 weeks for it to establish and settle in. Now, generally you don't feed them when you're planting them. You wait until they've established and they start to grow, then you can give them some food if you want to give them a bit of extra food. So something, depending on the plant, obviously, if it's an Australian native, you want to give it something like bush tucker. If it's vegetables, then something like rooster booster, which is an organic food you can give your plants. When you are planting a new plant in, something like sea salt, water it in with sea salt, because that's a root tonic, and that will strengthen the roots, and that will just give the plant a boost to start establishing itself into the ground. Always make sure your ground is wet if you are going to feed any fertilizers. And like I said, if I'm talking about fertilizers, I'm talking about organic, real, natural, no chemicals or artificial products, because you don't want to be eating that sort of stuff. You don't even want that in the environment. It's just not worth it. And there's plenty of good things these days that you can actually buy if you don't have your own compost and chickens and ducks and an established garden where you can cut plants and put that back into the soil. So if you're just starting out, you don't have anything to add in. So something like like I said, rooster booster, or I think dynamic lift might be another product. Always make sure you clean your tools with methylated spirits in between plants, because you don't want to be spreading any diseases if they've got diseases. And even if you can't see a fungus or a spore, you don't know. So always just dip them in. I have a container with a lid on it outside that's got methylated spirits in it, and I just dunk my secateurs in it in between plants, so that I'm trying to keep my garden as healthy as possible. Yeah, it's a good idea to have a bit of methylated spirits in the garden, out of reach of children, of course. And then you can just have it handy and dip your tool straight into that. That's what I do anyway. I always maintain my tools that have wooden handles, whether it's my axe or rake or my little shovels, whatever the handles are that are wooden, I make sure that they're painted with linseed oil, and that's a raw linseed oil that I paint on. Usually I do it in the warmer months because I can sit outside and paint them up and they dry really quickly. The oil just soaks straight into the wood, and that just gives it a longer life. And also sharpen your tools every now and then. Your secateurs can just go on the knife sharpener that you use if you've got a block sharpener, and also occasionally sharpen your shovels as well, and of course your axes, because working with sharp tools makes life a lot easier. And it also prolongs the tool life as well, because you're not trying to force it to do things that it's just not able to do if it's blunt, and then that damages the edges. With pruning, there's different times of years that you prune things, and there's reasons why you prune certain things at certain times, and this can be a little bit confusing, I think, for some people. They're just not sure when to prune, or they do it and they don't know why they're having certain things happen in their garden. For example, I prune my ornamental plants, which are non-fruiting or berries or whatever. I prune my ornamental plants when the sap is flowing. The general rule is to prune your ornamental plants after they've flowered. Now, this doesn't apply to standard roses though. It does with climbing roses, but not standard roses. Standard roses, you wait until the end of winter when the plants are dormant. Don't do it too soon in winter, because when you do prune standard roses, it triggers a hormone in the plant that actually starts new growth. Now, if you're pruning them a little bit early because you just want to get it done, you want to be organized, don't. Because when it triggers this hormone and the plant starts growing, you're getting frost and you'll be knocking that new growth about, and it could damage your plant. So it's better to be patient and wait for your standard roses. But all the other ornamental plants, prune them after they've flowered. Fruit trees, which is more of our topic, you prune them in winter when they're getting established, You don't have to prune citrus these days. Back in the old days, we used to prune citrus pretty hard. You can prune citrus, but just go light. You don't have to prune citrus. It's not as important. The main thing is if you've got a grafted citrus tree, that you make sure none of the roots start growing up. So you always want to make sure that anything pruned under the graft, you prune all that away, because you don't want that something coming up from the rootstock, because that'll be a really strong, hardy plant, but it won't be what you want to be growing, which is what's grafted on top. So that is the main thing with pruning citrus, to make sure it's under the graft. I mean, that's the same with any grafted plant. Anything that's grafted, don't let anything below the graft grow. Keep that cut back. With fruiting trees, you want to prune them in winter when you're shaping them and you're trying to encourage growth and get the shape you want. Once you get the shape you've got and you've got a really established fruiting tree, then it's best to prune it in the summertime to stop growth. That stops it from creating new growth everywhere, because you've already got the shape you want and you're just trying to keep it into that shape. There are always exceptions to rules, so that's why it's probably tricky to know when to do things. Passion fruits, for example, you prune late winter or early spring. Now, this depends on your seasons. So when it starts to warm up, it might be the end of winter, or it might be early spring, or it might be mid-spring, depending on where you live. Where I live, it's a really good idea to mulch your plants. It keeps the moisture in, it keeps the soil warmer when you're getting towards the cooler months. It's like a protective layer, and it adds nutrients back into the soil as well. The things I use are, there's a product we use called Hooflung Dung, which is an awesome mulch that has micronutrients in it. It is brilliant. I'm loving it. And it actually is helping to stop the weeds as well as adding micronutrients into the soil, which I'm always all about, adding micronutrients to the soil. So that's a product called Hooflung Dung. It comes in sort of like a bale type thing, but it's wrapped in plastic, which I'm not a big fan of, but that's how it comes. Other products are something like a sugarcane mulch. A couple of items I recommend that you don't use in your garden, whether it's an ornamental garden or a food garden, is car tires, because they leach out horrendous chemicals that are cancer causing, so you don't want them in your garden, especially near a food garden, and don't grow your potatoes in them. Also, weed mat. Now you're probably thinking, hang on, but weed mat, isn't that designed to put in your pathways to stop the weeds coming up? And yes, it will do that. I mean, the weeds usually end up growing on top of it, but it actually kills the microorganisms in the soil. So every year, the tests are from the CSIRO are that if you have the weed mat down, every year you've had that weed mat down, it takes 20 years for that soil to get better, to be back to alive again, because it actually kills the soil. It's killing all the microorganisms, and it's actually quite devastating. I had no idea of that when I put it down in my perennial garden a few years ago. So as soon as I learnt this information, I ripped it up, and now I'm treating my soil to get the microorganisms back into that soil, to bring it to life, so it's not going to take 20 years for that to happen. I'm feeding it with go-go juice. It's like a probiotic for your soil. So it adds in actual beneficial bacterias and all the good stuff that you want, the alive, living stuff, and you just spray that on. You mix it up with water and you spray it on as recommended, and that actually adds in the bonus benefits, and it will get that soil kick-started so that those microorganisms can breed and develop. And then I mulch it with the Hooflung Dung, because that also has micronutrients and good bacterias in it. And then I'm just bringing the soil back to life. So we'll see how that goes. That's how I'm treating it. Also, you can throw on compost over the top, which is what I will be doing, and aged animal manures. And I'll be really putting a lot of attention onto that to bring that pathway back to life. And I say pathway, I've got my kiwi plants growing the roots go into that pathway, and then I've got my citrus trees on the other side, as well as different perennials in there as well. So it's medicinal and food that I'm growing in that garden bed. There is a new product as well called Propagate. I haven't used it yet, but I'm hearing rave reviews about it, and they're saying it's even better than the go-go juice. So when it's time for me to get a new bottle, I might try that if I can get hold of a bottle. I think it's a bit hard to get at the moment because it's only new and everyone is raving about it. Go-go juice is also something that I occasionally add into my compost to give it that extra boost. So after I turn my compost, I then put a little bit of that into my compost to activate it even more, to make it get better and break down quicker, so that I can get it onto my garden beds quickly. When you're new to food gardening, and when I'm saying food gardening, I mean medicinal and food gardening as well, so if it's herbs or whether it's vegetables and fruits, all of that sort of stuff. When you're new to it, you don't know how the plants will grow necessarily. So you don't know how much space you need when you're planting them in the seed trays, or if you're planting them directly into the ground outside. Things need different amounts of space depending on what they are. And that's a learning curve, because say for example, you're planting herbs in seed trays like this. These are my little chili plants. If I was planting chives, I could plant about 20 seeds in one of these and then pull that out when it was sprouted, and then that could go straight in the garden, because each seed is one chive stem. So it doesn't take up much space at all. So you need more around it so you can have a mass of seeds. So hundreds of seeds in an area like this would be brilliant. Whereas if I'm planting a chili, these are chilies, I would plant one of these in a terracotta pot about this size, or it could go directly into the ground, and then have it staked or growing up against another tree, or like a small fruit tree or something like that if it was in pots, so long as it could still get the sunshine. When you plant and grow things where you live, it's going to be variable depending on where you live and the seasons that you have where you live. If you live in a tropical area, you're not growing your summer crop over the summer usually, because that's the wet season, and that's when your tomatoes will get diseases because it's too humid and wet. Whereas you can grow them over your winter beautifully. I really love growing citrus. Citrus is a really important crop for me, and I love it so much. And one of the reasons I love it is because it fruits in winter. Well, generally. My lemon tree pretty much fruits most of the year. There's only a few weeks of the year I don't have fruit, unless I get a fruit fly attack on it, and then I have to pull all the fruit off, and that part of the season is wasted. But then a new crop will come in the winter, and it'll be fine over the winter, because I don't seem to have fruit fly being a problem in the winter at this stage. But citrus is an important crop to me because the fruit stays on the tree, and you can have fruit for long periods of time. And in the winter, when it's all grey and gloomy and wet and miserable, you've got beautiful bright yellow and orange fruits that are so cheerful and full of vitamin C, which is just what you need in the middle of winter every day to ward off those colds and flus. But citrus trees are heavy feeders. They like a lot of nutrition. So I get my chicken and duck poop that's mixed in with the straw, and I put it around the base of the citrus trees in a big circle. Not close to the trunk though, because you don't want it to get collar rot. So you keep any mulch away from the trunk, just a few inches around, so that there's good circulation and airflow around there. And then a big circle is of the extra nutrition that I put around the trees at the base. You can also feed them every 2 to 3 months. I'll make sure I feed them some extra stuff at the start of every season. That's just a reminder. It's like, oh, it's a new season, time to feed the citrus trees. You can feed them some dolomite lime. Now, not normal lime, not just plain lime, because it's actually a different product. Dolomite lime is, I believe it's a magnesium and is it calcium? I can't think offhand. But that's the one you want. It's a dolomite lime, and you can sprinkle that around the base of each tree. underneath the poop if you've got poop, or compost if you're adding compost in. Also, you could give rooster boost or a dynamic lift as well if you don't have poultry poop to add on top of the soil around the base of your citrus trees, and then you'll be guaranteed to get plenty of fruit and that the leaves will stay nice and green. It's easy for citrus trees to start looking a little bit yellow. It happens to me and I'm doing all the right things. It's just that they're such hungry plants that they like a lot of nutrition, and sometimes you forget to feed them, or they're just extra hungry because they're growing. They also have a fairly shallow root system, so mulching them is a really good idea, especially if you live in a really hot climate like we do. And I say I live in a temperate, cool climate, but it's hot in summer. We get heat waves of mid-40s, so it can be insane heat, and that's just normal for us. And of course, usually it's dry here, apart from this year, which is the wettest year, I believe, in history that we've had. So it's usually we're in drought, so it's important to make sure you keep your citrus trees watered in the summertime especially, because that's when it's setting fruit for the winter. So if you don't get a good crop in the winter of citrus, it's probably because you didn't water it enough in the summertime, and regular water as well. And that helps to sweeten up the fruit too if you regularly water instead of sporadically watering. And you do need to water your vegetables regularly as well over the summer period when they're growing. It's a good idea to raise your garden beds up. You don't necessarily have to build anything to raise them up, but just raise them up so that they've got good drainage and that they're not sitting in water, because your plants don't like that. You might live in an area that gets rain and watering's not really a thing that you have to do, so that'd be pretty cool actually. We might have a summer like that, you never know, after the winter we've had. There are so many different types of pests that we could talk about when it comes to food gardening. It's a good idea to treat the pests or prevent the pests from coming in the first place by planting things in different locations so that you don't have a monocrop. Companion planting can work as well. So if you're planting basil near something that gets whitefly, it can be a deterrent. But I do find with the whitefly, which is the tiny little white flies that sometimes come in, they like things like my hollyhock and even my mint and lemon balm. What you can do with that is you can get yellow sticky paper and you can hang that up underneath the plants so that the bees don't come to them, and the whiteflies, they hide underneath the leaves usually, they will be attracted to the yellow, they'll stick to it and it will kill them. I've never caught a bee with one of those, but I've caught plenty of whiteflies. So if you put it under the leaves, yeah, like so that the bees aren't getting to it and the whiteflies will find it, and that's a good trap. And you don't have to add any poisons or sprays to it, so it's really beneficial. I have also tried another way, which is vacuuming them up early in the morning, give it a shake and vacuum it up, but I was finding that wasn't working. I wasn't getting on top of the problem by doing that, but it was worth a try. So I have tried that way as well. I hope this information gets you inspired to get out into your garden and to grow lots of food. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.